Welcome to the Simple Weapons System tutorial. In this video, we'll be learning how to make a simple weapons pickup system, as well as a gun that we can shoot and do damage to items and enemies. I'm going to be using the player controller we've been building in previous tutorials, as well as the breakable crate we've built in a previous tutorial. If you haven't already gone through those tutorials, I highly suggest you do. Links to the tutorials and downloads to the scene packages are in the description. There are a lot of ways to do weapon and item pickups in games, and the method we'll be doing today will resemble the kind of systems arcade shooters use. So you see the item there in the world, you can walk over to it, and it's automatically given to the player. If you are holding an item already, your currently held item will disappear and your new one will be equipped. First, we'll set up our player to use the things that they pick up. A very simple way to do this is by giving our player an FSM that can send a use event to the items they're holding. For the sake of this tutorial, I'm going to be naming the event after the default input axes. You'll see that here in the input manager, we have fire 1, which is left click and left control, and fire 2, which is right click and left alt. Okay, so let's get started. On the player, I come over here and create a new FSM, and we'll call this player shoot. The first state we can call fire buttons. And let's add some events here in our event tab. One will be called fire 1, and another will be called fire 2. You can set both of these as global events by checking these boxes. Now we're going to add in a set event target action, and we'll specify the game object as the player's item holder. If you don't have an item holder like I do here, then you can create a new one by right-clicking on your player camera. And you could create an empty, but it helps to create a 3D object like, let's say, a cube. And I'm just going to scale it down a little bit. And now when I move it out in front of the camera, we can actually see it, and we have a good reference as to where the items will be when you place them somewhere. So I'm going to put it right about here. You can kind of imagine that this is where our gun will be held. And then I'll just delete this mesh render and cube component and box collider. So now this is just an empty game object, and you can call it something like attach or item holder, whatever you want. So back in our player shoot FSM, you could drag and drop that in there. I'll go ahead and use that, even though I already have another one over here. Now for this action, we want to send the event to children and have this checked every frame. So what happens here is anything that's nested under this attach object, in other words, any children of the attach object, will receive events we send from this. We can send events using the get button down action. Let's put in a couple of these. So the first one will be for fire 1 and for fire 2. These are calling on the input axes from Unity's input manager, and we'll have them send those events that we just made. These fire 1 and fire 2. Fire 1, fire 2. The names don't necessarily have to match. You can have these buttons fire off other things, other global events you might have throughout your system. But for our case, it just makes sense to name them the same thing. Any children of this item holder game object, this attach game object, will receive the fire events when we press these buttons. Now let's make something to actually pick up, like a basic pistol. I have this pistol prop from Cinti's Polygon prototype assets. Just dragging into the scene, and I'm going to put it in front of our player camera just off to the side. It's still a prefab, so I'm going to unpack prefab completely. Now we can make changes to this without affecting the prefab. And I'm also going to rename it to pistol. To give this pistol some functionality, we're going to need to give it an FSM. So I'm going to go ahead and do that and call it shoot. In this shoot FSM, I'm going to make the start state our initialize state. And I'm going to add in 7 new states. So this first one will be called idle. And then I'm going to have another one called have ammo question mark. And then I'll have another one called click. Then another one called shoot. another one called subtract ammo, another one called type check, and then lastly I'll have deal damage. Okay, so let's get a quick overview of this FSM. Initialize can be used for getting and setting variables that we're only going to need to get once. And then this idle state will be where the player is waiting to press the shoot button. The have ammo ? State is where we can check if there is any ammo left to be shot, and if there is, it goes to the shoot state. And if there isn't, it just goes back to this click state. The click state is where a little empty gun click sound will play. And the shoot state is where the gun will play its sound, shoot a raycast out, and store whatever it hits into a variable. The subtract ammo state is where we will reduce the ammo count by 1 only after the player fires a shot. Type check is where we'll check what kind of thing we shot, whether it was an enemy or a prop. And then deal damage is where we'll reduce the health of the thing that we hit. So that's doing damage to a crate or an enemy. So starting with this initialize state, we'll leave it blank for now, but it will be there for us if we ever need it to, say, sync the UI to the weapon for an ammo counter or something. We're just going to give it a finish transition and send it off to idle. At the idle state, all we're going to do is give it a fire 1 transition. So this is that global event we created, and if this pistol is ever under the player's item holder, it'll get that fire 1 event. So as long as it's at the idle state, it'll shoot by using this fire 1 event. And when it does, it'll send off to the have ammo state. Okay, so we can even give this a try right now to see how that works. I'm going to take this pistol and I'm going to put it in the item holder. And if I press play, if I click, it shoots that fire 1 event to the have ammo state. Just for testing purposes, I had this pistol as a child here, but I'm going to take it out again because we're going to want to be able to pick it up later. So having that kind of system is cool because now whenever we want to create new weapons or tools, we just have to add the fire 1 transition to give it that functionality. Now that we could use the pistol, let's actually make it do something. So in our have ammo state, we're going to add in a int compare action. And in the variables tab, I'm going to create a new int variable called ammo count. And I'm going to set it to 30 by default. That seems like a good amount to start with. Okay, so in the int compare, we're going to compare the ammo count to 0. And if it's equal or less than, it can send an event we'll call no. So equal or less than. But if it's greater than, we'll send an event called yes. So after I add those transitions in, we could send the yes to the shoot state. And if you select on this yes transition, holding control, you could use the arrow keys to move it up or down. So I'm going to put yes at the top right here. And I'm going to hold down control to keep these states locked to the grid, keep things nice and clean. So if we do have ammo, it goes off to the shoot state. If we do not have ammo, it's going to go down to this click state. Okay, in the click state, we're going to add in a play sound action. Here is where you could drag in your empty click sound effects. Now, so I could take my empty click sound and just drop it in here. Add a finished transition and send that back to the idle state. So if there isn't any ammo, you first hear a click sound before coming back to the idle state. In the shoot state, I'm going to throw in another play sound action. But this time I'm going to put in my pistol fire sound. Then I'm going to throw in a ScreenPick. And we'll put that after it. This is like a raycast that gets sent out from the camera to wherever the mouse clicks on the screen. All right, I'm just going to pop over to this other example scene just to show you how ScreenPick works. So the scene is simple. I have a plane here which has a collider on it. So when I use my ScreenPick, the ray that shoots out into the scene actually has something to collide with. Then I have the cube here, which is on the ignore raycast layer. So when I'm using my ScreenPick, it's making sure to ignore this. So if I hit play, If you look here in our game display, the cube gets sent to the center because there is a ray shooting out from our camera. So if you look at the game screen in terms of an XY coordinate in 2 dimensions, you can look at the cube as being halfway across the X coordinate and halfway across the Y coordinate. In other words, it's at 0.5 and 0.5. So that's our screen vector. Now, that's only our screen vector if we have this normalized box checked. Normalize turns the bottom left corner of our screen into the 0 points for the X and Y values, and the top right of the screen to a 1 for the X and Y values. So you can see if I put this at 0, 0, our cube's now down here in the bottom corner, and similarly 1, 1 puts it in, you can barely see it over here, but that's putting it at the top right. So at 0.5, 0.5, that's the middle of our screen. So again, that's just with normalized on. If I didn't have normalized on, and I have 0.5, 0.5, it puts it down here. Now what's going on here? Well, actually, without normalized on, what it's going off of is the actual resolution of the game screen. The reason we want to use normalized is because people are going to have all sorts of different screen resolutions, and you want this to adapt to be a more universal way of programming our ScreenPick. So you can see right now that I'm running this at a 1024 by 768 resolution, right? So even if I scale it up and down, it's always, that's the resolution of it. It's 1024 by 768. So you can see up here, if I put 1024 by 768, it goes to the top right again. That's like its 1, 1 value. It's maxed out. And still, it's the same thing with 0, 0. It goes to the bottom left. Now, you can imagine that the halfway point of 1024, you could put something like 500 and 350, and that puts us at about the halfway point. But you have to hard code that in for this specific resolution. Instead, it's going to hit normalize, and going to change this to 0.5, 0.5, which takes us at exactly the halfway point, no matter what our resolution is. And that's how ScreenPick works. For the screen vector in ScreenPick, I'm going to put 0.5 and 0.5. We're going to store this game object in a new variable called hitObject. And then we're going to store the point in a new variable called hitPoint. Have this layer mask set to 1, and we're going to have ignore Raycast, and then invert mask. So it selects everything except for things on the ignore Raycast layer. Something to note is that when you're using a ScreenPick action, you're going to need to specify what the main camera is that it should be picking from. The way you could do this is by selecting your camera and making sure it's tagged as main camera. Next, we could throw in an explosion action, putting this at the bottom. And I'm going to set the center point to our hit point. You can imagine that there's an explosion that gets created from the exact spot that the ScreenPick hits. So we're going to set the force to 1, the radius to 0.5, and the upwards modifier to 1. The upwards modifier, you can see this little tooltip, says applies the force as if it were applied from beneath the object. Okay, and the force mode will be velocity change. So we'll throw in a game object is null action, which will go after that, and it'll be checking our hit object. If that value is null, and null means nothing, that means if there is nothing in this game object, then we'll send the event yes. If it's not null, that means if there actually is something there, then we'll send no. So yes is going to go off to subtract ammo, and no is going to go to type check. I'm going to move these like this. So in this subtract ammo state, we can add in a int subtract action, and it'll be from our ammo count. We'll subtract 1 because we fired 1 shot. And then I'll just throw in a wait action right after this. And I'm going to call this new variable reload time. In our variables tab, I'll actually just set that. Something like 0.1 should be good. That way there's a bit of a buffer between firing shots and you can't just spam. So when that wait action is done, it can send off new event next. It can transition back up to idle. In the type check state, we'll add a game object switch, tag switch. So a tag switch checks the tags of a game object and then compares it. It's like having multiple compare game object tag actions in one action. So we'll be checking our hit object and we'll have two tags to compare to. We need to make the tags first by going up to tags, add tag, create a new one called prop and enemy. So back here in our pistol, we can now get prop and enemy. And so this way you can have different outcomes for different types of things. I just wanted to show you a cool way to handle shooting different types of things, but again, for the example, we're actually just going to be sending them both to the same place. So I'm going to set them both to next, and this will be sent off to the deal damage state. In the deal damage state, we're going to throw in a set event float data action and a send event action. The float data we send will be how much damage this does. So I'm going to set this to something like 5. And now we need to send an event to carry that data. So we'll specify our hit object. And we'll be sending the global event damage. If you don't already have this damage global event, you can come over here to events. You can type in damage. I already have it, so it's telling me. You can type that in, and if you hit enter, it'll pop up over here, and then check this box to make it a global event. But if you've been following along with the other tutorials, just select that damage event. And that means that enemies and props will have a state in their topmost FSM, which will have that damage global event. So when they receive this, they can react accordingly. Okay, so I'm going to add a finished transition here, and I'm going to send it to the subtract ammo state. All right, so this is pretty good and set up. Now let's make the pickup game object that floats around in the world that gives the player an item or weapon when the player walks over it. So we can start by creating a empty game object, and we'll call this pickup. So here's our empty game object floating out here. I'm going to give it a sphere collider. And that looks like a pretty good size for our player to pick up. And now I'm going to give it an FSM. I'm going to call the FSM pickup. And editing this FSM, first state, it's going to be called initialize. And we're just going to use this state to set up a variable for this pickup. We can do this with a get owner action and create a new variable. Call it this pickup. Next, we can throw in a create object action, and we'll specify a new variable called prefab, and then set its parent and spawn point to this pickup. So this is going to create a prefab at this exact point, and it'll be a child of this pickup game object. Now we can add in a rotate action, and we'll rotate around the y-axis, say 45, and we'll set to per second, so that'll have a nice, slow, steady rotation for the pickup. And then we'll add in a wait action, and we'll say 60 seconds, and after 60 seconds is up, we'll have a new event called timeout. And this timeout event will fire off to the next state, where we can call this disappear. Here you can throw in a destroy self action. We're going to want to use this pickup FSM more in the future, and so to make our lives easier, we can templatize it. So first hop over to variables tab and select the prefab variable. And then down here, you can check this little input box. So now it shows up here in our component in the inspector. This will give us access to the variable from the scene, even after we make it into a template. Without checking this input box, when we convert this into a template, this wouldn't be available to us from the scene. So this part's pretty important. So this is a pretty cool way to templatize things, but still interact with the scene in a more hard-coded way. Okay, so if we right-click in the FSM editor, click Save Template, save this as Pickup Info. You'll see that there's a folder specified for your PlayMaker FSM templates. All right, I'm gonna hit save, and it's asking us use the save template in this FSM, and we're gonna say yes. Okay, so now you'll see that this PlayMaker FSM component has been given a template. Okay, so for the prefab, we're gonna wanna give it our pistol. So what we can do is, I already have all these prefabs over here, and one of them is actually already called pistol, so for the sake of this tutorial, I'm gonna take our pistol, I'm gonna rename it Pistol 2, because why not? So now if I turn this Pistol 2 into a prefab, okay, we have it down here, it's a prefab now. I'm just gonna get rid of it, take it out of the scene. But now in our pickup here in the scene, I could drag and drop this pistol into that prefab slot. This way you can duplicate your pickups, put them around in different places, and you can actually give it different weapons or items. See, I just gave this one a bazooka. I'm actually gonna give this one another pistol. So there's 2 pistols in the scene now. Okay, we're almost done. The last thing we need to do is give our player an FSM that actually picks up the pickups. So with our player selected, scroll down here, add new component, new FSM, and we're gonna call this one pickups. The first state will be called check for pickups. And it's gonna have a collision event action, which waits for on controller collider hit. So this is working with our character controller collider that we have on our player. If you're not using a character controller component, you're gonna have to set it to something else like on collision enter or on collision stay. We only wanna collect things that are tagged as pickups. So we're actually gonna add a new tag and call it pickup. Okay, so I'm just gonna select these 2 pickups and make sure that they're tagged as pickup. So our player will only pick things up that are tagged as pickup. And then it'll send an event, pick up, and it'll store the thing that it collided with in a new variable called pickup. So let's send off this transition to a new state called create prefab, and then we're going to throw in a get FSM game object action, and we're going to specify our pickup. So it's going to get a game object variable from the FSM in this pickup, and the variable name will be prefab. Okay, so what that's targeting is on our pickups, we have this prefab variable. So now our player knows to look for that. So we have prefab here, and then it's going to store it in its own local variable we'll also call prefab. Next, we're going to throw in a couple of destroy object actions. Okay, and the first one is going to destroy the pickup, and the second one is going to destroy a new variable called held game object. So this is going to be whatever the currently held game object is, whatever the player is currently holding. We want to destroy it because we only want the player to be able to hold one thing at a time. So after it destroys the thing that the player is holding, we'll do a create object action, and the game object we're going to create is the prefab. So whatever that pickup had as prefab, we're going to be creating into the hands of our player now. We want to spawn it and parent it at the player attach point. So we can drag and drop our player attach points here. And we want to store this object as our held game object. So setting this held game object variable is a way to ensure that the next time we run through this set of actions again, when we pick up something else, it will destroy whatever we were holding. So this is where we set that held game object. And lastly, we'll just throw in a wait action, put this at the bottom, and we'll have it set to something like 0.2 seconds. And I'm going to give this a finished transition and send it back to the check for pickups. Now, before I hit play, I just want to show you what we'll be testing the gun out on. Okay, so let's modify our breakable crate. This breakable crate you can learn how to make from our breakable crates tutorial. The simple system it has right now is that it just waits for a collision, and then when it does get hit, it checks the force of it, and if it does have enough force, then it deals 1 point of damage to itself. And there's another FSM here
where it constantly checks that health, and if it ever hits 0, it breaks apart. Also, an important thing to note here is because we are using send events to exchange information between FSMs, we want to make sure that the FSM we're talking to, the damage FSM, is the one at the very top of all of the other FSMs ordered in this components list. Unless you're saying specifically which FSM to target, the default FSM targeted will be the first in line, the one at the top of the list here in the components. So the way we want to modify this is in such a way that we'll deal 1 point of damage whenever it gets shot, not having to rely totally on this force part, this collision part. So if we take a look at our gun here, it's setting this event float data and then sending an event called damage. So whatever the object it just hit was, will receive this damage event. And with that damage event, it'll come packaged up with this float data set to 5. So to use events and event data as a way to talk back and forth between objects, it's a two-way thing. So on one end, you have to have the thing that's sending the event and setting the event float data, or whatever type of data you're sending. And then you have to have on the other end, the get event float data, or get event whatever type of data you're sending. So you'll see down here, it just says, get float data, and it's just a variable that it stores that info from. So in our case, wherever we put this get event float data, it'll be storing this 5. So let's give this to our breakable crate. So I'm going to hop into our breakable crate, and the first thing that we're going to want to do is give it a transition damage. I'm just going to move this up, and I'm going to send damage off to this deal 1 point. Because our gun is going to be sending this damage event, we only want it to be sending here from our first state. If we made a global transition, you could fire it off whenever, and that can really screw things up. So send it off from our start state. This damage sends off to deal 1 point, but it won't do anything yet until we add in our get event float data. So I'm adding this in, and we're going to get a new variable, and we'll call this damage amount. Okay, and then in this float subtract, instead of just subtracting 1, we'll subtract our damage amount. So when it starts up, it's waiting here, but then if we shoot it, it gets this damage event sent off, comes here, gets the event float data damage amount, which would be 5, and then it subtracts from its health that damage amount. Little problem that could pop up here is, depending on how much damage your gun does to the crate, you might end up leaving this crate in such a way that even pushing it around and waiting for collisions would deal 5 damage to it, since this damage amount just gets set the one time. So in order to mitigate any errors, what we could do is add a set float value here in the first state, and we'll always just reset our damage amount to 1. And we're just going to make sure our breakable crate is tagged as prop. So now if I run it, I can grab our gun, and boom. Now something that's interesting here is that if I shoot at the floor, if I highlight our gun, you'll see that it's stuck here on this hit something state. And that's because it did hit the floor, and you'll see that here, this floor game object. But the floor game object isn't really tagged as anything, and this game object tag switch is only looking for things tagged as enemy or prop. So the way we can fix that is simple. We just hop into our gun here, and in this state, we could just add a third option, untagged, and we don't really want it to do anything, so it'll just send to false, and false will send back here to the subtract ammo state. So we're at least losing ammunition, but nothing else really happens after that. Should be able to run the game now. So I should be able to come over here, pick up the gun, and shoot, and shoot the floor. You'll see if I have the gun selected, it runs through the FSM, nothing happening, right? Because I'm shooting the floor. But if I shoot the crate.
All right, so in the spirit of previous videos, let's just go ahead and duplicate some of these boys. Be sure to check out our other videos to learn all the various features of PlayMaker. Links to more learning resources are in the description.